That morning, nobody knew the border was designed to be violated. March 23rd, 1848. The Rio Grande cut through Texas territory that carried the dust of territorial expansion and the thunder of American manifest destiny. 8 engineers from the United States Army Corps received orders that bore no official War Department seal. Orders to investigate reports of Mexican military positions hidden behind American defensive lines. Orders that came with surveying equipment that didn't match regulation specifications and mapping documents that showed boundaries not approved by any Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo documentation. Moving toward coordinates through territory that had been secured by American territorial campaigns, carrying instruments that felt different from standard issue, toward positions that appeared on no operational maps approved by General Winfield Scott. The mission briefing had lasted exactly 18 minutes. Locate suspected Mexican military installations operating within American-controlled territory. Document enemy fortification capabilities for future territorial operations. Survey Mexican defensive positions against American expansion standards. Standard engineering operations for an army fighting to establish territorial control over former Mexican lands. Except nothing about this mission was standard, starting with the fact that their target coordinates were at American land development sites that had been under private American control for months, not recently captured Mexican military installations. Captain First Class Patrick Michael O'Sullivan checked his surveying instruments and studied the territorial maps ahead. Irish immigrant from Boston, who had joined the Army Corps of Engineers to build American territorial infrastructure and defend democratic expansion. Expert in military engineering and territorial surveying from years working on civilian railroad construction, had volunteered for this assignment because he believed the intelligence reports about Mexican military capabilities, because he trusted his commanding officers to provide accurate information about territorial threats, because he thought classified missions were classified to protect American expansion operations, not to hide activities that would disgrace people who had never surveyed hostile territory or faced Mexican resistance forces. First Lieutenant Heinrich Wilhelm Müller carried the territorial analysis equipment that had been modified with surveying instruments he didn't recognize. German immigrant from Pennsylvania, who spoke fluent Spanish and understood territorial engineering, had enlisted to fight for American territorial expansion after witnessing European land conflicts displace his relatives in Germany, wanted to establish American territorial control and prove that democratic expansion could defeat authoritarian land management. Had no idea that defeating Mexican territorial control sometimes required activities that were indistinguishable from the land speculation they were fighting to prevent. That fighting Mexican territorial administration sometimes meant discovering Mexican collaboration among those claiming to oppose it. The Territorial Development Facility appeared through morning heat, like something that didn't belong in American-controlled territory. Not the crude Mexican military installations that characterized most Mexican Army logistics operations behind territorial lines. This was sophisticated land development infrastructure, modern territorial surveying facilities designed for mapping railroad routes and mining operations, railroad connections that led to American commercial networks rather than Mexican military installations, and most disturbing of all, construction equipment that was developing territorial infrastructure, despite reports that claimed all Mexican territorial control in the region had been eliminated by American expansion campaigns. Second Lieutenant Carlos Eduardo Ramirez raised his field glasses and studied the facility. Mexican-American from California, who had grown up around territorial boundaries and understood land management. Expert surveyor who could identify military installations from civilian development operations. Natural reconnaissance specialist who could distinguish enemy facilities from friendly installations. But nothing in his training had prepared him for what he was seeing through those field glasses. Buildings that were clearly designed for territorial development and land speculation operations. Equipment that belonged in American railroad companies, not Mexican military installations, and workers moving between buildings who weren't wearing Mexican uniforms, weren't wearing American uniforms, were wearing civilian clothes that looked distinctly American. Sergeant Antonio Giuseppe Benedetto carried the explosives that were supposed to destroy Mexican territorial stockpiles. Italian immigrant from New York, who had lost relatives to Austrian territorial occupation, had volunteered for dangerous missions because he believed eliminating Mexican territorial capabilities would establish American expansion and save territorial settlers, because he trusted that American territorial forces were fighting for expansion and democracy, because he thought the explosives he carried would be used to eliminate installations that threatened American territorial operations, not to destroy evidence of activities that American officials couldn't afford to acknowledge. The territorial facility was operational, not abandoned by withdrawing Mexican forces, not captured by advancing American armies, not destroyed by expansion campaigns that intelligence claimed had eliminated all Mexican territorial control capabilities in the region. Operational and apparently developing territorial infrastructure that required sophisticated equipment, skilled engineers, and ongoing territorial logistics, activities that someone was willing to risk 8 American engineer lives to investigate, or eliminate, or cover up. Corporal Thaddeus Washington Brown was the unit's specialist in territorial mapping and land documentation. African American from Virginia, who had joined the Army Corps of Engineers to fight for American territorial expansion and prove his engineering loyalty. Expert in territorial survey and land development analysis, could examine territorial specifications and identify discrepancies in land engineering, had joined this mission to ensure that captured Mexican territorial technology was properly analyzed for American expansion improvements, had no idea that proper analysis sometimes revealed improper activities, that fighting for American territorial superiority sometimes meant discovering Americans who were betraying those principles for commercial advantage. Private Stanislaw Kazimierz Kowalski handled communications and territorial industry analysis. Polish immigrant from Illinois, who had joined the Army Corps to prove his American territorial loyalty. Expert in territorial logistics and land speculation, finance. Could operate communication equipment under combat conditions. Could analyze commercial territorial records and identify suspicious development activities. But the records he was analyzing weren't Mexican territorial documents, were American land development ledgers, were industrial communications discussing American territorial expansion activities at what was supposed to be a Mexican military facility. Private Jean-Baptiste Dubois tested the territorial equipment that had been provided for the mission. French immigrant from Louisiana, who had enlisted to fight for territorial freedom and prove his surveying abilities. Expert in territorial construction and land development systems analysis, could identify defective territorial components and faulty land development manufacturing. But the equipment he was testing wasn't protecting American territorial forces from Mexican territorial control, was exposing American expansion to systematic sabotage that was designed to cause American territorial operations to fail during conflicts with Mexican territorial forces. Private Joseph Running Bear served as the unit's tracker and territorial reconnaissance specialist. Native American from Oklahoma Territory, who had joined the Army Corps to fight for American territorial expansion despite tribal land losses. Expert in territorial navigation and land analysis, could track enemy movements and identify territorial threats through traditional scouting methods combined with military engineering. But the territorial activities he was tracking weren't protecting American expansion interests from Mexican territorial control, were exposing American territorial operations to systematic manipulation that served Mexican territorial interests rather than American expansion objectives. O'Sullivan signaled for his team to observe the development facility from concealed positions. 20-year territorial veteran who had surveyed civilian land since before the war, had seen action against Mexican territorial forces in the Texas Territory campaigns, understood that territorial warfare required difficult decisions and dangerous intelligence operations, but also understood that some activities crossed lines that couldn't be uncrossed, that some orders required questioning, even when questioning orders could be considered mutiny against American territorial authority, that some missions revealed truths that were more dangerous than Mexican territorial control. The development facility contained territorial infrastructure that didn't match any known Mexican or captured American expansion designs, didn't match Mexican Army specifications that American territorial intelligence had documented, matched American land development patterns, matched territorial construction techniques, matched land surveying specifications that were identical to projects that American companies created for the United States Army Corps of Engineers, matched the kind of infrastructure that American developers created under territorial contracts with both American and Mexican land authorities. Through field glasses, the engineers could see surveyors working on territorial projects wearing American land development clothing and using American territorial construction techniques, could see wagons arriving with materials that bore American territorial contractor markings, could see finished territorial infrastructure being used for projects that were designed for both American and Mexican expansion specifications, could see territorial equipment that was identical to systems used by American land contractors and developers, could see evidence that proved this facility was American, not Mexican. Mueller intercepted territorial communications that confirmed their worst suspicions, conversations in American accents between territorial personnel who were discussing land specifications, development schedules, and payment arrangements, not military communications about supporting Mexican territorial operations, commercial communications about territorial development, about land expansion operations that were creating territorial conflicts for American expansion forces while simultaneously providing territorial intelligence to Mexican buyers, about activities that violated every principle of American territorial independence while generating substantial profits for American developers. Ramirez discovered that the territorial infrastructure being developed contained engineering defects that were deliberately designed below expansion combat specifications, surveying equipment that was inadequately constructed and would fail during extended territorial operations, construction materials that were improperly manufactured and would break under expansion stress, communication systems that would malfunction when American territorial forces needed maximum performance during conflicts with Mexican territorial control, development defects that weren't accidents or quality control failures, were systematic sabotage designed to ensure American territorial defeat while maintaining plausible deniability for American developers who were profiting from both sides of the territorial conflict. Benedetto used his territorial engineering knowledge to examine the facility's development methods and saw something that changed everything. Construction equipment that was identical to machinery used in American land development companies. Development techniques that were standard in American territorial construction. Quality control procedures that were being deliberately subverted to produce defective infrastructure for American territorial forces, while maintaining superior standards for projects destined for Mexican territorial service. Evidence that proved American developers were sabotaging American territorial effectiveness, while claiming to support American expansion superiority. Brown realized that the American territorial operations they were supposed to be supporting were being undermined by Mexican territorial forces, equipped with intelligence manufactured in American facilities by American workers under contracts with American companies who were being paid by the American government. Intelligence that was designed to fail when American territorial superiority depended on their reliability, operations that were constructed to break under expansion stress, projects that were systematically sabotaged to ensure Mexican territorial superiority, commercial betrayal that was generating profits while destroying American expansion effectiveness. Kowalski examined the commercial documentation and recognized business procedures that were identical to systems used by American territorial companies and land contractors. Logistics that were designed for supplying both American and Mexican territorial forces from the same development facilities. Transportation networks that were moving superior territorial intelligence to Mexican territorial control while delivering defective information to American expansion forces. Commercial operations that were prolonging the territorial conflict to maximize profits from both governments. Dubois analyzed the territorial component samples and identified systematic use of inferior materials that would reduce expansion effectiveness by approximately 70%, surveying components that had been constructed with materials that would fail under territorial stress, communication systems that had been deliberately weakened through improper construction, territorial logistics systems that were designed to malfunction during critical expansion operations, development materials that were designed to fail during the most critical moments of territorial conflict, quality control that was ensuring American territorial defeat while providing Mexican forces with reliable intelligence that would give them decisive advantages in territorial warfare. Running Bear used his tracking expertise to analyze territorial movement patterns and discovered that the facility was coordinating with Mexican territorial forces to maximize American expansion failures. Tracking evidence that proved American territorial intelligence was being systematically provided to Mexican territorial control, while American expansion forces received false information designed to ensure territorial defeat. Native knowledge that revealed how American territorial operations were being manipulated to serve Mexican territorial interests rather than American expansion objectives. The engineers realized they weren't investigating Mexican territorial operations. They were witnessing American commercial activities that were using territorial conflict as an opportunity to generate profits by sabotaging American expansion effectiveness, while simultaneously supplying Mexican forces with superior territorial intelligence. Activities that were extending the territorial conflict, increasing American expansion casualties, and serving Mexican territorial interests rather than American expansion superiority. At 16:34 hours, facility security personnel discovered the American territorial observation positions. Security personnel who weren't Mexican Army officers or Mexican territorial technicians were American private guards employed by American territorial development companies who had orders to eliminate anyone who approached the facility without proper commercial authorization, who had been told that any territorial personnel in the area were Mexican infiltrators attempting to steal American territorial trade secrets, who had been given permission to use lethal force against American engineers to protect American commercial activities that couldn't be acknowledged without destroying American territorial credibility. The firefight began with automatic weapons, fire from positions that had been prepared specifically to eliminate territorial reconnaissance, Spencer repeating rifles, operated by personnel who had been trained to counter American engineer tactics, personnel who knew exactly how American territorial forces operated and exactly how to neutralize their capabilities, personnel who were killing American territorial forces to protect American business interests that were generating American profits while sabotaging American territorial superiority. O'Sullivan ordered his team to take cover while returning fire with Colt revolvers and carbines that jammed more frequently than regulation weapons should. Weapons that had been manufactured by the same contractors who were supplying the facility. Weapons that had been deliberately sabotaged to fail during territorial combat. Fighting American guards who were using superior firearms to eliminate American engineers who had discovered American activities that were officially denied. Mueller used his knowledge of German territorial warfare to outflank security positions that had been designed to counter Mexican forces, not American engineers, who understood European territorial combat techniques. Eliminated several guards who were carrying identification that proved they were American citizens employed by American territorial development companies that held American government contracts for territorial expansion infrastructure. Ramirez used his territorial knowledge to eliminate facility personnel who were attempting to signal for reinforcements that would overwhelm the reconnaissance team. Personnel who were using American territorial communication systems to contact American development executives who would respond with additional guards, and possibly American territorial forces who would be told they were eliminating Mexican infiltrators rather than American engineers who had discovered American territorial crimes. Benedetto used his demolition expertise to destroy territorial development equipment that was being used to produce defective infrastructure for American expansion forces, not to eliminate Mexican territorial capabilities, but to prevent American sabotage of American territorial effectiveness. Explosions that eliminated development machinery, destroyed quality control records, and killed witnesses who could have testified about activities that were funded by American taxpayers, but served Mexican interests rather than American territorial superiority. Brown used his documentation skills to gather evidence of American territorial sabotage while using his access to destroy commercial records that documented systematic betrayal of American territorial interests. Evidence gathering that preserved proof of American development crimes while preventing American companies from completing contracts that would have been profitable but would have ensured American territorial defeat through systematic expansion failures. Kowalski used his communication expertise to intercept and disrupt facility radio traffic that was attempting to coordinate the elimination of American engineers who had become inconvenient witnesses to American commercial activities. Communications that proved American development executives knew about the sabotage operation, approved of the territorial practices, and authorized the elimination of American territorial personnel who discovered what was being conducted in America's name. Dubois used his territorial expertise to analyze and document systematic sabotage while destroying development samples that would have been used to continue manufacturing defective infrastructure for American expansion forces. Analysis that proved American developers were deliberately weakening American territorial effectiveness while simultaneously providing Mexican forces with superior territorial intelligence that would ensure American territorial defeat. Running Bear used his tracking skills to identify and eliminate facility personnel who were attempting to escape with evidence that could be used to continue territorial sabotage operations. Traditional hunting techniques that served American territorial interests by opposing American commercial interests that were serving Mexican territorial interests rather than American expansion superiority. The engineers extracted evidence of American territorial sabotage while fighting their way out of the facility against American security guards who had superior weapons and better defensive positions. Evidence that proved American developers were sabotaging American territorial effectiveness while simultaneously supplying Mexican forces with superior territorial intelligence. Evidence that documented the use of American territorial contracts to fund activities that served Mexican territorial interests rather than American expansion superiority. But extraction required crossing territory that was controlled by American territorial forces who had been told they were searching for Mexican infiltrators. Forces that had orders to eliminate the reconnaissance team to prevent exposure of activities that could embarrass American development leadership and destroy American public support for territorial warfare. Forces that were willing to kill American engineers to protect American business executives who had never faced territorial combat or risked their lives for anything except commercial advantage. The pursuit began when American artillery began shelling coordinates that were transmitted by facility personnel who survived the engineer assault. Artillery bombardment that was officially attributed to counter-battery fire against Mexican positions, but was actually designed to eliminate American personnel who possessed evidence of American commercial crimes. Bombardment conducted by American territorial officers who believed they were supporting American expansion operations, but were actually participating in the elimination of American witnesses to American development activities. O'Sullivan led his team through hostile territory that had been mapped by American territorial surveyors who provided the information to American forces that were pursuing American engineers. Maps that showed every possible escape route, every potential hiding place, every source of water and shelter in the contested territory. Maps that gave pursuing forces decisive advantages against territorial specialists who were trying to reach friendly outposts while carrying evidence that could expose American development crimes. Mueller used his language skills to communicate with Mexican territorial forces who were operating in the region, convincing them that American engineers were carrying information that could expose American activities that violated the principles they had enlisted to defend. Information that German-American territorial personnel could use to embarrass American leadership that was tolerating development activities that were betraying the territorial expansion cause they had joined America to support. Ramirez maintained communication with territorial headquarters, providing false information about their location and status to prevent American forces from intercepting evidence of American territorial sabotage. Communication that required deceiving American territorial commanders who were participating in the elimination operation without understanding what they were eliminating. Communication that served American territorial superiority by opposing American developers who were betraying American territorial interests. Benedetto used his demolition skills to create obstacles that delayed American forces pursuing the reconnaissance team, obstacles that served American territorial superiority by opposing American commercial interests that were serving Mexican territorial interests, obstacles that protected American engineers from American forces who had been ordered to kill American engineers to protect American developers who were ensuring American territorial defeat through systematic expansion sabotage. The territorial conflict became a business model for activities that had nothing to do with American territorial superiority or Mexican territorial control. Operations that were designed to generate profits for American developers rather than to achieve American territorial objectives. Operations that prolonged the territorial conflict and increased expansion casualties, because ending the territorial war would end the commercial opportunities that made the conflict valuable to people who viewed American territorial defeat as business opportunity.